Well, these positions are presidential appointments. I was contacted because of my career in the airline industry, not because of particular political activity. They were looking for someone who had some deep business experience, and the focus really was on NextGen and the upgrade of the air traffic control system. So they wanted somebody with a business background that could bring some business principles to that really important project.
You just heard Mike Whitaker, former FAA Deputy Administrator, talking about that job, and in a moment we'll be talking with him about his activity as a private pilot and his thoughts on NextGen and the future of general aviation. Hello again and welcome to Aviation News Talk, a weekly show with relevant news and flying tips for pilots and student pilots to help keep you safe. I'm Max Truscott. By the way, if you have thought about maybe someday buying a Cirrus SR-20, SR-22, or even SF-50 Vision Jet, or you'd like some flight training in one, there are just a whole lot of things I can help you with in any of these areas, so please call me today, 650-967-2500 for a free consultation and possibly a free demo flight. Now, last week in episode 114, we talked about get-there-itis accidents, so if you missed that episode, you may want to check it out. And if you've found value in any of our shows at any time, please support us with just a small donation through our Patreon page at aviationnewstalk.com/awesome, or if you have a PayPal account, please make a one-time or monthly contribution through PayPal at aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal. And when you do, we'll read your name on a future show. Now here's our conversation with Mike Whitaker. And now let me tell you a little bit about Mike Whitaker. Mike has a long history of working in the aviation industry, and he also has a special interest in general aviation, which we'll be talking about today. When he became a lawyer, he opened a private practice representing GA manufacturers. Later, he went to TWA, then United Airlines, and in 2009, he became Group CEO of Interglobe Enterprises, India's largest travel conglomerate and operator of Indigo Airlines. In 2013, Mike was appointed by the president to serve as Deputy Administrator of the FAA, where he served as Chief NextGen Officer and was responsible for the development and implementation of the FAA's Next Generation Air Traffic Control. He left the FAA in 2016 and now advises airline and aerospace companies and is a keynote speaker. Mike, welcome to the show. I'm excited to have you here.
Thanks, Max. It's great to be here. I enjoy your podcast and glad to be part of it.
Well, thanks so much. We had a great time when you came out here a few years ago, spent the afternoon together, and you spoke at one of the presentations that we'd set up here. I wanted to just kind of go back a little bit. I know that you've got your private pilot's license a couple years ago, but you were also the Deputy Administrator for the FAA. Tell us a little bit about what that job is all about.
Well, Max, I did both at the same time. I became Deputy Administrator, and part of my job was being in charge of the upgrading of the air traffic control system. And I was not a pilot at the time, and I felt like to really understand the system, I needed to just not understand it at a theoretical level, but actually operate in the system. So I started the process, started working toward my private, and, it was a very interesting thing to go through. And as a Deputy Administrator, I realized as I went along the process that it would be very embarrassing if I didn't pass the check ride. So it had a little extra pressure, but it was a great experience and really allowed me to understand the system much better.
So how does one become Deputy FAA Administrator?
Well, these positions are presidential appointments. I was contacted because of my career in the airline industry, not because of particular political activity. They were looking for someone who had some deep business experience, and the focus really was on NextGen and the upgrade of the air traffic control system. So they wanted somebody with a business background that could bring some business principles to that really important project.
And as Deputy Administrator, are you kind of like the Vice President, or tell us what that role is like?
Well, it's the number 2 role, and working closely with Administrator Huerta. And we had some areas where he worked on his things and I worked on my things. NextGen was sort of an example of that. But mostly we worked very closely as a team and would decide how to allocate work, and worked very closely in conjunction with each other on NextGen, on safety certification, and ultimately on drones, which became a very hot issue while we were there.
Yeah, I remember in your presentation, you talked about the number of people who had registered with drone owners and how long those drones tend to last. Tell us about that.
It's true at the time. I don't know if this statistic still holds true, but at the time, the average drone completed 1.5 flights. And that's actually consistent with my own experience of people who've owned drones. The first flight goes well, and then the second one, interrupts a tree or a building, and it doesn't end quite as well. So, but it is a technology that has just taken over, and just hundreds of thousands and millions of these things coming onto the private and commercial scene going forward.
Yeah, I had to laugh when you use that particular line in your presentation, because I've had similar experience. I've probably owned 4 or 5 drones. They do seem to have a a attraction to trees.
Yeah, you don't need planned obsolescence if you're just going to crash them on the second try. So
that's great. Hey, so what was it like getting your private while being the number 2 guy at the FAA? Was that kind of like being in a fishbowl?
It really was, and I tried to kind of keep it under wraps. But eventually somebody asked you a question, inevitably, about your flying. And so, I flew from a little airport called Freeway Airport, just outside of Washington, D.C. So you're right in the controlled airspace, the special use airspace. You've got to get a squawk code to take off. You're constantly with ATC. It's a pretty small airport with about a 2,500 foot runway. So it's a little interesting. But it was a great experience, and I had a great instructor and great folks there at the airport.
And when you were out flying around, did you have a feeling that the folks you were talking to knew it was you?
There was definitely a feeling that I was being carefully watched, and my instructor and I would discuss this, and he thought I was being a little bit paranoid. But one time we were about to take off, and I called to get my squawk code, and they gave me a squawk code of 0001. So I felt like somebody was messing with me there.
Yeah, I think probably somebody knew. I mean, that's probably a big deal when the number 2 guy is out flying around there. So I know that at one point in time, you had some kind of incident that occurred where you had to file reports with the FAA and NTSB, and I know nothing about the details about that. Tell us what happened.
Well, after I received my license, there's always the question, what do you do with it once you get it? Because you've gone through all this structured training. So soon after I had my certificate, I made a cross-country trip from my local airport all the way up to New England, where I call home. And it was quite a long flight. It was about a 4-hour flight. I did it in 2 legs coming up to Lebanon, New Hampshire, and then one leg going back into such a stiff headwind that I would look down and see cars passing me on the interstate below. So I had to make a fuel stop on the way back. It was about a 4.5-hour flight and pretty gusty winds. And I would say, in retrospect, I was a bit over my head in that type of a trip at that point. But coming back through the airspace and making a landing at Freeway, I ended up doing a go-around as I came in a little bit fast and high, and executed a go-around. And the second time came around, and again a little bit fast and high, but decided it was time to put it on the runway. And that's what I did, including the prop. So had a little porpoising episode down the runway, hit the prop, and fortunately nobody was hurt except for the airplane. Taxied off to the side of the runway and had it towed into the hangar. But because it was a prop strike, it was a little bit in a gray area, but in an abundance of caution reported to the NTSB and to the FAA. So I was in the unusual position of being the number 2 guy at FAA and now being investigated by the FAA for not being a very good pilot. So it was, to say the least, an interesting experience to go through receiving the certified letters, having an interview with the local FSDO, and then ultimately having a check ride with the FAA to make sure I was still proficient to fly. So I put it in the bucket of learning experience, and certainly I learned a lot from that experience and did a lot of training, and certainly understand how to land an airplane a lot better now than I did then.
Well, if it makes you feel any better, I can think of 3 local pilots over the last 3-4 years that either I have flown with or that I knew reasonably well who've had prop strikes. So not terribly unusual. If you're thinking back about it, what were some of the factors that led to that? I mean, what do you think contributed to that happening?
Well, I think there are a number of things. One is the wind was a little more than I was used to. And as I did a little research on the fly, I came up with this rule of thumb that you should add half the gust to your landing airspeed. So I put a little extra airspeed in there when I probably didn't really need it. And certainly fatigue after 4.5 hours and sort of inexperience. So, and I think fundamentally, I didn't realize you can't force the airplane onto the runway. It's really got to settle down on its own free will. So, a variety of factors that became clear to me as I continued my training and got some special focus on landing.
Yep. Well, that's good. And thanks for sharing that, because I think we all profit from that. And do you think there was any kind of sense of, hey, get there, itis, I've just got to get this done, let's end this now?
I think absolutely, after a long flight like that. And I think the conditions were fine for landing. I just was, at that point, had too much speed on the airplane and just not sort of in that space where you've got everything in a nice stable approach at the right speeds coming in and just letting the airplane do its thing. Mm-hmm. So it's something that comes with experience.
Yeah, and I think sometimes that with these first few really long trips, pilots are just not fully aware of how much fatigue can be a factor and how challenging it can be to land at the end of one of those trips.
Right, and if you don't have autopilot and you're and it's a bit of a choppy trip, it can be pretty tiring after a few hours of that.
Yeah, no question. Autopilots are great, and turbulence definitely can enhance the fatigue even more.
Right.
Well, let's talk a little bit about general aviation, some of the history, and then a little bit of the future. I mean, everybody kind of talks about the good old days, the 70s. Wow, we built lots of airplanes back then. I know you've done some research into that. Tell us how you came to get interested in this and research that you've done.
The numbers around general aviation are pretty staggering when you look at the decline in the number of aircraft that have been manufactured and the decline in number of pilots. And it's something that I was very focused on trying to understand when I was at FAA. Were there things that the government could do to help this situation? What is the actual cause? And I guess after a lot of looking, I hate to use the term perfect storm, but there were an awful lot of factors that came together to lead to the decline of aviation. There was the product liability problems that happened with some big lawsuits over manufacturing, where one statistic back in the 80s, the average aircraft cost, there was about $1,300 attributed to liability insurance. After some of these lawsuits, that number went to over $100,000. So that's adding a very significant cost to the aircraft. But, there's also airline deregulation. The rise of Southwest Airlines meant that you could fly to Florida on vacation for $89. It's a lot harder to justify owning an airplane. Back in the 70s and 80s, those airplane tickets were dramatically more expensive. So if you had a family of 5, you could probably make the math work to justify an aircraft a little easier. And then there's the demographic issue. I mean, a lot of us are getting older, and the younger generation is just not able to perhaps afford the cost of flight training or disinclined to do it. I think there was just a big bubble of pilots after the war and the GI Bill. So these various changes have come to pass, and it has really dramatically reduced the number of aircraft that are built in this country and the number of pilots that we have.
And you had mentioned a couple of other factors in a presentation that I saw that you gave. You talked about affordability. Tell us about that a little bit.
Yeah, affordability is, I think if you're like me, if you grew up in the 70s, you had friends whose parents had airplanes, or maybe the local doctor had an airplane. And the cost of an airplane was not that far out of reach for somebody who was upper middle class income. But you look at the income disparity now and the sort of the squeezing of that category of earnings. It's just a lot harder for a physician, for example, to afford an airplane on the average physician salary today than it was back at that time. So it just has become a much more expensive hobby, and fewer people in that category who can really afford it.
Yeah, and I saw a note that in the 1970s, there were 88,000 airplanes produced. Obviously, we're building many fewer of those. So I guess costs are going up, but wages aren't.
Well, and that's another factor. If airplanes were as common as automobiles, and instead of producing 1,000 a year, we were producing 100,000 a year. You'd be able to get a much lower unit cost. But with those relatively small numbers, it means that the airplanes are going to be pretty expensive.
Mm-hmm. Now let's talk a little bit about technology. I know there's been quite a bit of a shift from what's being built in the general aviation, from pistons to turbines.
So I think there's a lot going on the technology front these days. And of course, the automation that we've seen in aircraft, just really amazing technology that you can have in your typical GA aircraft just with your iPad that commercial airline pilots didn't have 10 years ago. But I think to me, the thing I get the most excited about is electric propulsion. And if you look at the things that are likely to change the landscape for general aviation, I would point at electric propulsion. If you look at what's happened with cars going from piston engines to hybrid electrics to now electrics, if you have that same transition in aircraft, you can really change the economics of general aviation. Pipistrel, you probably know, has an electric trainer out. It claims that it's $3 an hour of electricity to run. So you compare that to a Cessna 172 where you're going to spend $50 an hour or more just on fuel. It could be a significant game changer. It was reported at the Paris Air Show that there are over 170 companies now trying to make electric or hybrid electric airplanes. That's a lot of people. That's a lot of capital flowing into this space. So I think that's a pretty exciting development coming down the pike.
Oh, I agree. I see it helping in a lot of different areas closer to what I'm doing in flight training. I think it's going to make the cost of flying around the pattern and practicing landings much, much, much less expensive. Now, with 170 companies, let's kind of look forward 20, 25 years from now. How many of those do you think will be in business shipping aircraft?
Well, I think clearly the majority won't be in business. I think that the interesting thing is the number of companies that are trying it. And these range from, there's a company in Burlington, Vermont, near where I live, that's got a secret project going on in a hangar where they're retrofitting an old twin to make it electric, all the way up to the Airbuses and the Boeings that are working on this kind of stuff. So someone's going to get it right. And, there's plenty of room for competition out there. And if someone comes up with a reasonably priced hybrid electric, and there's some safety benefits in this technology, just redundancy of having electric as well as piston in the same aircraft. I mean, there are really some advantages that could come both in safety and clearly on the cost side.
Mm-hmm. I'm thinking that project in Burlington isn't secret anymore.
I think I did see a photo, yeah.
No, I think you just told everybody about it.
Right. No, now I'll get everybody out there Googling it.
Well, that's good. Yeah, I agree. I think electric propulsion is very, very exciting. I watched a demonstration back in 2011 at Oshkosh. I saw a Laser experimental aircraft that was being used to fly on electricity, which really captured my imagination. Let's talk about experimental aircraft a little bit. How's that changed over the years, and what do you think their contribution is?
Well, I think, of course, you got to put in a plug for Oshkosh. It's the most fun you can possibly have in this area. But I think experimental has been a huge contributor. I think you've seen it on the avionics side, and you realize from experimental how low cost avionics can actually be. And I think it's created a lot of pressure to lower the cost for avionics. And I think it's helped FAA in its thinking to move toward the Part 23 philosophy of really allowing certificated products to get out faster, like light sport and like what we're seeing, sort of a surge in turbines. It's good to see movement in all of those areas, and it's more technology development that can happen and be cross-pollinated with other sectors of the business.
Now, I wanted to ask you about what kinds of things the FAA has done in recent years to help improve the climate for general aviation. And you brought up Part 23. I'm sure that's part of it. Tell us, kind of in real basic terms, what Part 23 is.
Well, Part 23 is designed to really recognize that it's not helpful for the government to try to specify every design feature of an aircraft. And rather than have a very prescriptive approach to regulation, basically have industry standards that say if you're going to build this aircraft, it needs to be able to meet these performance metrics. And as long as you can meet those performance metrics and reliability and durability, you can get certificated in a more expedited, more flexible way. It doesn't reduce the level of safety. I think you can argue it actually enhances safety, but it's a much lighter touch. And I think it's been a very successful approach. Part 23 applies to general aviation. I think that same approach will move throughout the various sectors in aviation that FAA regulates. The problem is it takes an awfully long time to rewrite an entire regulatory scheme, but I think it was a very successful first step.
Mm-hmm. And let's talk a little bit about safety. You had mentioned one time about how the CAS team, the Commercial Aviation Safety Team, had brought down accident rates. Tell us about that program and how you think things like that might be applied to general aviation.
Well, I think it's part of a sort of a broader theme that we've seen between FAA and industry over the years, that the more FAA and industry and pilots can work together on a problem, and the less of a sort of adversarial relationship, the better result that you get. So the CAS reporting has been very effective in identifying anomalies that airlines and cargo carriers experience but weren't reporting before. But if you get a broad group of these operators reporting anomalies, sometimes you can find patterns far before there's a problem. And that's really what you want. You want as much data as you can get, and you want to analyze that data effectively so you can bring safety to a much earlier level in the process. So if you think back to the old days, there'd be a plane crash, you would investigate the plane crash, you'd come up with a fix. Now it's much more about identifying issues way before they become a problem.
Yeah, and I think we're probably aware of some of the issues within general aviation that are problems, and yet I'm just not sure that low-time private pilots are learning about those issues. And we've just kind of talked about, one very simple one, flying on a long trip. I think, for example, I continually read about folks that take off at night. They've been a private for 6 months, and they're out there in the clouds or maybe the mountains and so on. I mean, how do we help educate low-time pilots to, some of these issues that are obvious to those of us who've been around for a while?
Yeah, that is a challenge. And I think part of that challenge, I think, gets met by things like Oshkosh and the activities of AOPA and others to raise awareness and have education be a continuous thing. I think from the FAA point of view, and I'm perhaps a poster child for this, the FAA has migrated from an enforcement mentality to a compliance mentality. So if you have a pilot who makes a mistake because they're a little rusty, it doesn't really make sense to ground them and let them become even more rusty, right? Really what you want to do is make sure that the pilot's skills and proficiencies are there. So the focus has shifted for FAA to, with pilots who aren't intentionally doing bad things, they're simply making mistakes, often due to lack of experience. FAA's focus has changed to bringing those pilots into compliance rather than sort of punishing them in the traditional way.
And I guess what that means is you're less likely to face a suspension of your license if you do have a problem?
Exactly.
Yeah, that makes a big difference. Tell us a little bit about NORSEA and Tech Refresh and how that applies to general aviation companies.
Well, I think that's another example of really working with industry to try to have a practical approach to avionics and to safety. So I think angle of attack indicator is probably the best example. It's not a required piece of safety equipment for general aviation. So do you really have to have the normal high standards for certification to have an angle of attack indicator in your aircraft? And I think the conclusions that certainly industry reached and the FAA ultimately reached is no. And in that situation, you need to have a more flexible pathway for avionics and for equipage. And angle of attack is a great example of that. The cost of equipage went down dramatically. As you know, when you go through an air show, you can find all kinds of angle of attack indicators you can install in your aircraft in a pretty straightforward way. It's a great safety enhancement. It's hard to quantify the impact that it's had, but I think the sense is that having an angle of attack indicator in your aircraft is an excellent safety enhancing device. And NORSEE is designed to make that possible.
And I should explain that NORSEE is NORSEE, non-required safety enhancing equipment, and just tell us briefly what that project or program is or was.
So NORSEE, we have to have an acronym for everything, as you say. And it's really just a streamlined certification process that just lightens the requirements for manufacturing and also installing that equipment.
So we've talked a lot about GA and how things have changed in the past, how the change in liability and affordability and alternate transportation with deregulation of all kind of affected GA negatively from its peak back in the 70s. Looking forward, what kinds of things do you think that we as individual private pilots could be doing to help assure the future of GA?
Well, that's a great question, and there's not an easy answer to that. I think we all know we have a big demographic bubble of retiring pilots. Trying to get the next generation enthusiastic about aviation, I think, is our mission. And when I occasionally speak with students, it's pretty easy for me to get excited about the career path for pilots these days. I mean, for most of my career, my pilot friends went through furloughs and changed airlines and went from mainline back to commuter. These days, with the pilot shortage, you can move pretty quickly through the ranks into a really excellent career with a lot of flexibility. And it's not just for pilots, it's also for aerospace engineers and other professionals in this space. So it's an excellent time to get in the business. And I think if you compare pilot training to other educational costs, it's a pretty reasonable avenue that pays back pretty consistently going forward.
Yeah, I'm surprised. I've seen a number of posts here just in the last few days on Facebook with newly promoted captains talking about their path. One of them was a lady, I think she had started flying lessons 4.5 years ago. She's now a captain at a regional airline. That's just a phenomenal trajectory.
Yeah, and I think people are coming out of the aeronautical university programs pretty much directly into regional carriers now, and then moving right up and finding openings in the mainline carrier. So it's a really, really solid career path. And just given the demographics going forward, I think it's going to be a pretty solid career path for quite a while.
Mm-hmm. Now you're talking about inspiring the next generation. It seems to me that when kids are somewhere, 12, 13, 14, they get the bug. Certainly that's what I did. And not all the people who get the bug are going to become airline pilots, but they may just be out there having fun like you and I. What kinds of things do we do to grab those teenagers or preteens and get them interested?
Well, and drones are perhaps going to be a key to this. I think the line between being a pilot and not being a pilot gets a little bit blurred as we now have this category called drone pilot with increased automation in the aircraft. Some of the new technologies that you're seeing proposed, while I remain skeptical about flying cars, I do think we're going to continue to see automation happen in ways where you have single pilot operations that can function autonomously. So I think the array of positions that'll be available is really going to open up pretty dramatically in the next decade or so.
Well, let's shift gears a little bit and kind of come back to your role as Chief NextGen Officer when you were at the FAA. Tell us about some of those programs and what GA pilots should be thinking about.
Yeah, the NextGen program really was what drove me to join FAA. It was a $20 billion program to upgrade the air traffic control system, which is a 24/7 high-stakes operation that you can't just sort of shut down and build a new one. So you have to do it on the fly. It takes a long time, but there's been really significant progress, and I think you could safely say that NextGen is wrapping up. The core piece of NextGen was the ADS-B technology. That gives controllers a better technology than radar. It allows them to see your aircraft more frequently and more accurately, and really replace radar, or in areas where you don't have radar, give the controllers coverage. So that system, the technology was installed in all the towers, in all the centers, all the TRACONs, and of course, by January of next year, all aircraft have to be equipped with ADS-B. So that's a pretty substantial, though gradual, change in the system. mean, there are some other pieces of NextGen. There's Datacom that allows sort of data communications to cockpits, from particularly with airliners. But I think ADS-B is really the cornerstone of that program.
The Datacom to airliners, that's something I've actually seen now with the advanced versions of ForeFlight. I think the $300 versions.
Right. And we all want to get our clearances, through a data source so we can push accept and have it go right into our flight director. But we're not quite there yet across the board, but it is coming.
Well, then certainly we're already pioneering clearances coming digitally to GA pilots through the airlines. Let's go way far into the future. Do you think we'll replace voice communications at some point? Is it possible that we'll be interacting with air traffic control when we're in the air via text message?
I think that what you'll see is a gradual reduction in the necessity of voice communication. So if you no longer have to call for your clearance and you can receive it electronically, then you've eliminated one category of very error-ridden voice communication, which is good. And eventually, as the tracking improves and the avionics improves, you wonder if it's going to be necessary to have quite as much communication en route. But, one thing I will say is that working with the air traffic controllers when I was at FAA, working on NextGen, they never resisted adopting these new technologies. They never had fear that it was going to put them out of jobs because the rate of change happens so slowly. And almost every program you put in place has a very strong safety case for it and generally gets very broad support by the air traffic controllers. But you have to think, if not in 10 years, certainly in 50 years, there'll be an awful lot less voice communication out there in the system.
Yeah, I think that would save a lot of the congestion we hear sometimes where people are stepping on each other and it's just hard to get a word through edgewise. So
that's right.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Well, we know that you have your private. What's next for you in the general aviation world?
Well, I've been working for the past 6 or 8 months on my instrument rating. Got a terrific instructor, former 747 captain with United Airlines, and so getting the real professional view of the process. And I'd say we're about 75% through the process, and it's been like going back to school and getting a master's degree. The amount of information. And of course, as a pilot, everything feels like it's crucial and you have to understand everything. And, particularly on the weather front, as you get your instrument rating, weather obviously takes on a whole new dimension of importance. So it's been quite a project, quite a workload, but very satisfying and hoping to get that completed later this summer.
Well, I have to say, instruments is my favorite topic to teach. And you're right. I think probably the big difference between instruments, I think it's more of a mental game, and getting your private's kind of more of a physical manipulating the controls game.
That's right. It really is very taxing on the brain, and it brings into very clear focus the phrase of getting in front of the airplane. So staying up on your work. And then the weather is its own. In my view, the instrument rating is sort of 50% weather and 50% flying. But it's, nothing could be more important than understanding the weather. So
yeah, and another 50% deciding whether or not to go into that weather at all.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah, that was my biggest misconception as an instrument pilot. I just kind of thought, this is an all-weather rating, and what I learned rather quickly is no, this is
right. That's right. Yeah, you quickly learn that there are just places you don't want to be, and for me, I'll put in a small plug here. I really felt like I needed to understand weather from the very basic point of view, and FAA does put out some really excellent handbooks on a variety of topics on how to fly airplanes and how to fly instruments. But their weather handbook is really a very valuable resource. It really practically goes back to the Big Bang and takes you all the way through to predicting thunderstorms. So it's a really good, comprehensive review of weather.
Yes, and another one would be the weather services book from FAA. So that dives down even deeper with all the charts and legends and detail.
Right.
Yeah, the FAA books are great. I used them, 40 years ago plus when I was working on my private, and I still recommend them today. They've been updated.
Yeah, they're so comprehensive. They really just cover. If you have a obscure question, you can find it in one of those handbooks.
You know what? I'm going to put a link to that in the show notes so that anybody who wants to find them can just go ahead and click and find a free PDF with all this information. Well, now that you're no longer with the FAA, What kinds of things are you doing in the aviation industry? What keeps you busy these days now?
Well, I do some consulting for some airlines and aerospace companies and sit on a couple of boards. And so I managed to stay very involved with what's going on, particularly on the drone front. It wasn't what I intended to get involved with in this field, but just from my time at FAA, drones went from being about 0% of what I was focused on to being almost half of what I was focused on. So that technology is moving very quickly, and a lot of big name companies are trying very hard to get it in a big way. So a lot of challenges for regulators on how to integrate this technology in a safe fashion. So it's a pretty active area.
Well, Mike, we have covered just a wide range of topics here. Where do people go to find out more about you and what you're doing these days?
Well, I have a website, Whitaker Airspace, so you can get the basics on there. But I'm staying active. I speak at conferences and stay involved with some aerospace companies, large and small, to keep up on what's going on in the field.
And I'll go ahead and put a link in the show notes here to your website, whitakerairspace.com. Mike, I want to thank you so much for your time today. This has really been illuminating, and hope to have you back sometime.
Great, Max. Thanks for having me, and I really appreciate your podcast. It's doing a lot of good in this space.
Well, it's great having someone such as Mike, who's so experienced in so many different aspects of aviation, working in our industry to help make it better. If you're looking for a keynote speaker or advisor to an aviation company, look him up at whitakerairspace.com. And I got to tell you, he was out here for a presentation that I set up a few years ago, and we were going to go flying in an airplane together, and it was just so windy we didn't. So we just decided on the spur of the moment, hey, let's go visit the tower at the Palo Alto airport. So there we marched on in and said hello, and I think people were a little surprised that their boss's boss showed up to say hello, but it worked out incredibly well, and we certainly had a great time together when he was out here. So Mike's a great guy, and I want to thank him for coming on the show. Now, I've had a couple people tell me recently they've been planning to sign up to support this show, but they just haven't gotten around to it yet. And if you're one of those people, please do it today. I try to add a few supporters every month because we lose a few supporters every month because either their financial circumstances changed or perhaps their credit card expired. Now, you can sign up in two ways to send a few bucks a month. If you have a PayPal account and you'd like to make a one-time donation or sign up for a monthly donation, just go to aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal. Or head on over to our Patreon site where you can sign up via credit card, and if you do, you'll get access to bonus goodies such as scripts for our show and extra aviation news stories that we didn't have time to read on the show. And you'll find our Patreon site at aviationnewstalk.com/awesome. And yes, I'll read your name on a future show if you sign up. And if you want to leave any listener questions or give us any feedback on the show, go to aviationnewstalk.com and click on Contact at the top of the website. You can also use the contact form to reach me if you're interested in tips on buying a new or used Cirrus, or better yet, call me at 650-967-2500 and leave a message. I specialize in the Cirrus and work with people around the world. And don't forget to tell your friends about this show, because that's how we get most of our new listeners, when people like you tell their friends about the Aviation News Talk podcast. And if they don't know what a podcast is, just send them over to the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store to download our dedicated Aviation News Talk apps for iOS and Android. In the App Store, just search for Aviation News Talk, 3 words, just like you would for any other app on your phone. And of course, those apps are free. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up.